Welcome everyone to the CSSC webinar, Chemical Safety, It's More Than WHMIS. We're pleased to bring you this webinar as our final topic of 2019 and one that touches on so many workplaces. My name is Erin Crisfield. I'm CSSC's Lifelong Learning Consultant and I'm your host for today. Before we begin, I want to give you a bit of a tour of the GoToWebinar doc for those of you who are new to that. One of the things you'll see is a chat area, which is where you can enter your questions you have for Rob at the end of the chat, end of the presentation, or if you have any technical questions, you can enter your questions there. Another area you'll see is the handout, and that's where you can download your handout for this workshop, this webinar, and that includes places where you can type in your notes as you go. There's key points there for you, things that you can take away from the webinar. There's also a place that indicates your audio, and you'll see that you're muted for the webinar. So really the chat area is where you can communicate with us, ask us questions, you can participate. We'll also for you today, so get your mouse fingers, clicking fingers ready for those polls as they come up on the screen during the webinar. I'd like to introduce you now to Rick Condon. He's CSSC's Digital Marketing and Communications Specialist, and he's providing technical support for us today. Hi, Rick.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
So Rick will respond to any troubleshooting questions you type into that chat window. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter for today. Rob Halsworth has a degree in chemical engineering from Queen's and an MBA from the University of Western Ontario. He has spent 30 years in industry, including 17 years in executive roles. Rob co-founded Relia Technologies, how companies manage hazardous materials in order to reduce workplace injuries and illnesses. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you to everyone for attending. I have to say, I've been surprised in the last 3 years how broadly the word WHMIS has entered into the Canadian vocabulary. You don't meet many people who've never heard of the term. Even if I'm in a social setting and someone says, "What do you do?" when I describe my work, they're familiar with WHMIS. So it is really a uniquely Canadian term that most people are familiar with. Yet we don't see many organizations who translate WHMIS into effective chemical safety activities to protect workers. Today, I want to provide some simple steps you can use to make that move. These steps are covered in 3 broad activities. First, we'll talk about how to turn WHMIS information into action. Then we'll talk about how to use the hazards to generate that action and how it's easier with hazards than focusing on chemicals. And then how data analytics can reduce your workload and take that large volume of work you see in front of you from a WHMIS perspective and make it manageable. The case study will show how these 3 items are brought together in one organization to make that change from WHMIS to chemical safety. Lastly, we'll talk about steps you can take now to move forward. These steps are highlighted throughout the webinar by a key point graphic in the upper left corner, but we'll review them at the end so you get that overview. Throughout the webinar, Erin mentioned that we're going to have 4 polls. The first of these is just to get your thoughts or input onto what we're talking about, and I'm going to turn it back to Erin for our first poll.
Right, folks, so you'll see that poll up on your screen now. The question is, which of the following is the biggest challenge in your organization? Make your selection. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. From those 4 options, what's the biggest challenge in your organization? Got a few votes coming in. Nice to see. We got a good breakdown so far on responses. About 3/4 of you have voted, so I'll give you a couple more seconds for any last people who are choosing between those 4 options. All right, so at 79%, I'm going to close that out and share the results with you. So 18% say keeping an accurate chemical inventory, 9% obtaining up-to-date SDSs, 55% understanding chemical hazards, and 18% providing chemical-specific training. So there's your results.
All right, thank you. So over the last few years, we've spoken with hundreds of individuals about WHMIS and what they do with it. The consensus feedback we have received is that organizations are overwhelmed by the volume of information they must retrieve and review, which really corresponds to answer C on the poll, understanding the chemical hazards. Now, many of us have experienced a time when you've felt overwhelmed. One common response to that feeling is to focus on what you can do. And within WHMIS, that focus has become keep your sheets up to date. So most people know that they have to get their safety data sheets up to date, and that's reflected in the poll. But what to do next is the challenge, because the information is just too overwhelming for people to handle. Just to give you an example, the average organization we work with has 200 different hazardous products or hazardous chemicals. That equates to 2,400 pages of information. So that's the type of volume of information that people have to deal with. So the question is how to turn that information into action. I spent 22 years working with ExxonMobil including 14 years as a plant manager in a chemical plant. I know that management systems and good processes are the keys to not only outstanding safety performance, but outstanding business performance. So we thought about what would a process for chemical safety management look like? It starts with the foundation that most organizations have today, and that's the access to information, educating employees on WHMIS, and providing up-to-date safety data sheets for all the chemicals you have in inventory. The next phase is how you control those risks, control the hazards. And that really has three parts. Do I know the hazards? Can I assess the risk? And then do I have plans to mitigate the risk? And this is a pretty standard risk assessment type process. The third phase is the training, the chemical specific training. And this can become quite complex if you don't understand the hazards and your process to mitigate them. And the objective here is to provide employees with clear, simple instructions that they can follow. The last part is the audit and review piece. Now, we would have viewed this as a management responsibility to review and ensure that the system is working. And I think it's important to have good chemical safety that management is on board. As we've talked to people over the last 3 years, we've seen that employers really struggle with three key responsibilities in this. The first is knowing what chemicals they use. This chart represents one of our clients in their 5 locations. They gave us a list of all the chemicals they used, and these are the figures represented in red. In one location, the list was quite old, and we said, you probably want to go and do a physical because this list is probably not up to date. They asked us to do that physical, which we did, and we found substantially more chemicals than they thought they had. As a result, they went and they checked all their locations. And overall, their original list, the red bars, was only 70% of their inventory list, the green bars. A real challenge to stay on top of your chemicals, particularly if you give broad responsibility for people to select and purchase chemicals. The second thing is really understanding hazards. The task of updating sheets is often assigned to clerical staff or summer students, maybe someone on light duties, or it's contracted out to a third-party service. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if the only person who looks at the sheets and handles your sheet doesn't look at the hazards, how do you get that overview of what are the hazards in your organization? The third key activity is around training workers on the chemical-specific instructions. And what we see is people are not proactively training their employees, their workers. They're actually waiting and reacting. In this case, you see it in the form of a question, but often that reaction takes place after something has gone wrong. And that's really the difference between managing risk, which is a chemical safety approach, and reacting to a hazard post-event, which is typically a crisis because someone is being hurt or exposed to a chemical. So one of the things we hear from employers is, well, we empower our workers. And they may say something like, we've provided WHMIS training and we've updated the safety data sheets. That empowers workers to take a more active role in safety, and they can protect themselves. I am very much in favor of worker empowerment. I've seen many times where it has delivered exceptional results. But I also know it doesn't work for everything, and just saying someone's empowered doesn't make them empowered. And I would say empowerment doesn't work for WHMIS. And let me give you 4 reasons why we have just found that empowerment doesn't work. And as you think about your own process, these are things that you need to recognize before you start pushing work down into the worker level. Now, I'm going to reference Ontario regulations because that's what I'm most familiar with. But in WHMIS, in Ontario, the word chemical appears 15 times. If you look beyond WHMIS to other acts and regulations, such as the Building Code or the Fire Code, the Environmental Protection Act, or even the broader Occupational Health and Safety Act, the word chemical appears 211 times. Said differently, most of the regulations that specify how chemicals are to be used safely are not contained in WHMIS and are not found in the safety data sheets. You can't expect workers to understand and act on these broad range of regulations when that information is not even provided to them. As we started reading safety data sheets, we saw the benefits, but also the limits of the information they provide. To test this, we looked at sheets from a whole range of suppliers. About 70% of suppliers will tell you something like, wear appropriate gloves, or wear chemical resistant gloves. They don't tell you specific types of gloves to wear. Now, we've shared this with managers, and many of them are surprised by this fact. In fact, in one case, we explained this to a manager, and he was particularly outraged. And how can the supplier get away with this? And the reason for this outrage is he honestly believed the safety data sheet provided explicit information that workers could act on. But not only do the safety data sheets not provide that, the Ministry of Labour doesn't expect them to. I mean, what they say is suppliers are not expected to anticipate every protective measure for every workplace. And let me use an example to illustrate why the suppliers really can't do that. One of our customers was mixing formaldehyde and phenol. The SDS for formaldehyde said to wear nitrile gloves. The SDS for phenol said to wear appropriate gloves. I think most people, if they were given those two pieces of information, would assume that nitrile is appropriate for phenol. It's not an unreasonable step to make. But if you talk to a glove supplier, they would tell you nitrile is not appropriate for phenol, and you should use neoprene gloves, which are also appropriate for formaldehyde. What makes this use of nitrile for phenol especially problematic is phenol is an anesthetic. So when it breaks through your nitrile gloves, you won't feel it. Plus, it's extremely toxic in contact with the skin, and it's readily absorbed through the skin. So an example where the SDS and the supplier really can't predict what exactly you're going to do in your workplace. I mentioned earlier about the volume of information that is provided through WHMIS. 200 safety data sheets is 2,400 pages of documentation. And I use the 200 safety data sheet number because across the 40 people we've worked with, where we have gone through their entire collection of products, that's the average number that they have. Now, 2,400 pages of information. If you were Bill Gates, who can read 150 pages an hour with a 90% retention rate, it would take you 16 hours to read all those safety data sheets. If you're not Bill Gates and you're an average person, it would probably take you 100 hours to get through the technical information. And does anyone do that? And do you want people to do that? Is that really a realistic expectation? Now you could say you don't need to read the entire sheet. You just need to look up the information you need. For example, what kind of gloves to wear. We've already reviewed that information may not be in the safety data sheet. But the other problem is, what if the workers don't ask the right questions? One company we were working with was using a floor sealant to protect their lobby. When we read through the sheet, it said heat will cause phosgene gas. That's critical safety information to have, but not something the average person is going to think to go and look for. The fourth issue we see around empowerment is the bystander effect. The bystander effect is a well-documented phenomena that says when confronted with a difficult situation, an emergency, or a large volume of activity, people don't act. In simple terms, it really says the more people there are, the less likely any one individual is to act. And there's two reasons for that. The first is we think that someone else is better equipped to handle the problem than we are. But the second one is, if we see other people not acting, it reinforces our view that we're not responsible for acting. So if the group doesn't act, we typically don't act. So when it comes to handling chemical in the workplace, most people are bystanders. We think, if that product was hazardous, someone, the government, the supplier, my supervisor, the health and safety department, someone will let us know the hazards and how to protect ourselves. We also look at our peers, and if they're using the product without using protection or protective measures, we think it's okay. But the question is, if empowerment doesn't work, how can we improve chemical safety? So one of the key precepts of what we do is we focus on the hazards as opposed to the chemicals. So the question is, can you get the hazard information from WHMIS 2015? And the answer is yes, because they provide clear standardized hazard statements at the start of the safety data sheets. So let's think about hazards as opposed to chemicals. I came across this quote a couple years ago in my work, and it really sums up what I've learned from 30 years working in industry trying to keep people safe. It starts with hazard recognition. If you can't recognize a hazard, you can't keep yourself and others safe. So I'm going to pause for a second, and we're going to go to our second poll.
And that is up on your screen now. How many different chemicals with unique CAS numbers are now in existence? So this is one for you to see if you can guess what the number is. They're all big, but which one is the one that's appropriate for this? How many different chemicals with unique CAS numbers? Got half of you voting, so get those clicker fingers going. Responses coming in fast and furious here, Jane. Yep, almost. And I'm going to close that out and share the results. So we had 9% say 150,000, 18% added a 0, 36% added another 0, and 36% chose the highest number in your list there, Rob. So wait and see what the correct answer is going to be.
Thank you. So the correct answer is 150 million different chemicals. Just a reminder, CAS is the Chemical Abstract Service Number. That number is given to every unique chemical as they're created or developed. Products can be comprised of many chemicals and have many CAS numbers associated with the product itself. What you see is that the growth in the number of CAS numbers has been exponential, with over half the products that are available taking place in the last 10 years or less. We're using chemicals for more and more things. Think about your own experience of what we use chemicals for today versus what we typically have in the past. So 150 million different chemicals and growing. Contrast that with the United Nations globally harmonized system for labeling and management of chemicals, which is the basis for WHMIS. They have 79 hazards. So if you're looking at what do I manage, it's a heck of a lot easier to think of 79 hazards than it is of 150 million chemicals, which can be turned into literally billions and billions of different products. The other advantage of looking at hazards is typically how regulations are written. This is an excerpt from the Industrial Establishment Regulations in Ontario, and talks about a skin hazard. It would be much easier to manage or ensure that you are meeting this requirement, this regulation, if you could say, I know all the chemical products I have that have the potential to cause damage to the skin. And it's not just skin damage. Most regulations are written in the context of a hazard as opposed to the context of the product name. The last reason that we see around hazards is you can triage them. Now, triage is a medical term. If you're my age, you came across it probably watching MASH on the TV, but it's a way to assign priorities to people in a medical emergency to utilize those scarce resources. Now, it's moved into common use in many areas and really means that idea of how do I best use my resources to tackle the work in front of me. Within WHMIS 2015, you can easily triage your hazards. Oops, sorry, got ahead of myself. So here's a list of all the skin hazards in WHMIS. 8 hazards. They have different categories, different signal words, different symbols. But just looking at this list, you can instantly see what are the more serious hazards and which are the less serious. So fatal in contact with skin clearly is much more hazardous than causes skin irritation. So this idea that within WHMIS you can triage your hazard and really focus on the most serious hazards is one of the key things that we see as a way to improve safety. The second part of our solution is to use data analytics. So what is data analytics and what does that mean? So data analytics can give you insights and opportunities that you can't see in the overwhelming volume of information contained in your WHMIS program. It distills information down to really critical points. That allows you to prioritize and focus efforts on managing risks and improving environmental health and safety. And these insights, this data analytics is based on the information in your safety data sheet, the hazards, and the ingredients. So let's pause and check in with another poll question.
Right, so this one is specific to your workplace. How many carcinogens do you have in your workplace? There's 4 options for you there, from don't know to up to more than 20%. So give it your best shot or your best knowledge, depending on how you're approaching it. How many carcinogens in your workplace? About half of you have voted. Oh, great, so interesting number of responses coming in, range of responses coming in. We're at 93% here, so I'm going to close that, share the results. So 23% said they don't know how many carcinogens are in their workplace. 0 to 10% of all chemicals, 46% put themselves in that range. 10 to 20% of all chemicals, another 31% said their workplace is in that range. Nobody said more than 20% of chemicals, Rob.
All right, well, thank you for contributing on the poll. I'm going to come back to that one shortly. We're going to dive down into some of the analytics and what it shows. But I do want to start at a higher level. I'm going to show you 4 charts. Each of the charts is in a similar format. And what they show is the frequency with which the item on the left shows up in this review of 40 organizations. And it's expressed as a % of the total sheets available. So in this case, this chart looks at the overall signal word for each of the 200 products, or think of it as the signal word for each of the products in your collection. So just under 50% of the products in a typical collection that we've seen has the signal word danger, but 25% don't have a signal word at all. So if I just gave you this information and said, set your priorities, I think it'd be pretty easy to say, well, geez, there's half the sheets that have the signal word danger. I need to work on those before I work on warning. I probably don't need to do anything about the sheets that have the word none. So this is the idea of I'm starting to reduce my workload by using the hazard information within WHMIS and an overview of my entire collection to say, what are my priorities? What do I focus on from a chemical safety perspective? But let's dig a little further. This shows hazards symbols with that have the signal word danger associated with them. So along with every sheet having a signal word associated with it, every hazard statement has a signal word associated with it. So each hazard statement has a signal word, a hazard class, and a hazard symbol. So here we've shown the average or the typical organization, the frequency with which symbols occur associated with the signal word danger. So what you see are health, flammable, corrosive, toxic, and oxidizers. With a health symbol being most frequent at about 23% of products, and again, in the work we've looked at, 23% of the products have a health symbol associated with the signal word danger. What's interesting is if you look at the health, the corrosive, and the toxic, or the skull symbol, they all represent in health hazards to employees. And there's roughly twice as many health hazards as there are flammable hazards. Well, we tend to think about chemicals from a flammable perspective. Really, it's the health hazards that are much more prevalent than the flammable hazards. Now let's drill down even further and look at the health hazards. And here we see the answer to the question. So, excuse me, across 40 organizations, 17% of the chemicals they use, or the hazardous products they use, are carcinogens. The may cause cancer, which is the signal word danger, is the red part of the bar, and that's about roughly 8% of that number. And suspected of causing cancer, meaning it's known to cause cancer in animals, but the case in humans has not been confirmed, is the blue part of the bar, and that's about 9%. So on average, organizations have about 17% carcinogens in their workplace. So those of you who either knew or guessed that 10 to 20%, that's what we have seen. I would tell you, no organization we worked with knew the answer to this question before we completed their analytics. And no organization was carcinogen-free. And while many have worked to reduce or eliminate the products that have the potential to cause cancer, the best we've seen is getting that number down to about 3%. But you can also see at the top of this list are things that would be the more acute route of entry type hazards: skin, eye, ingestion, and inhalation. And the most common one, skin, at the top of the list is 10% danger and 48% warning. Said differently, almost, well over half your products in your collection have the potential to cause harm to workers' skin. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are 79 unique hazard statements within WHMIS 2015. These 12 account for over 90% of the hazard statements with the signal word danger in our 40 organization review. If you had no other information, none of your own analytics, this would be a place to start to assess how well you're doing protecting workers from hazardous chemicals. And again, cause of serious eye damage, the number one most frequent hazard statement with the signal word danger that we've come across, shows up in just over 14% of all the sheets. So this is a chance to say, how do I protect people when I've got this type of hazard profile in my organization? Well, the way you protect people is the way that most people in the safety profession are familiar with. You call it the NIOSH triangle, but it starts with, can I eliminate or substitute the product? Can I find something that doesn't have the same level of hazard? One of the challenges that we see is when people are selecting products, they're selecting it based on the benefit of the product, what it does, or the price. How much does it cost is a key factor that some people use. Or how it's marketed to us. What's the name? What's the appearance? What's the promotional information that's provided in part of our product selection process? But what if you used the hazards to select your products? Would you make different choices? Now, we do a fair amount of work with municipalities, and one of the big things in municipalities is graffiti removal. So we've seen a large number of products in use. But let's look at just two different products just based on their hazard symbol. So here's the first product, graffiti remover. It's got the health, flammable, compressed gas, and the exclamation symbols. The second graffiti remover has the exclamation symbol. And the exclamation symbol is only ever associated with signal word warning. It's never associated with danger. Based on this information alone, which product would you choose? So being able to compare products based on hazards, is one way to improve chemical safety and start addressing those most common risks that are found on the previous list. Now, it's not always possible to eliminate or substitute products, and sometimes you do need to manage the risks. One of the things with chemicals is that the same type of hazard can often be managed the same way. So this idea of common controls. And so if you could identify common controls that work across a wide range of products with common hazards, you can really simplify that safety process within your organization. So let's look at the three types of controls. The first are the engineering controls. That's changing the workplace. And from an inhalation perspective, that typically involves ventilation, be it general or local ventilation. But if you're looking at engineering controls and ventilation, if you could look at every hazard in your workplace that was problematic from an inhalation perspective, either directly from an inhalation perspective as an acute hazard, or even the chronic health hazards, such as may cause cancer, you may come up with some different conclusions about how to manage your ventilation process. The next one is the administrative controls. That's the safe use, the instructions, the procedures. For example, limiting the duration that someone's exposed to a chemical. But if you're going to limit the duration, making sure that you understand what other chemicals have a limit in duration of use, and how do we ensure that people don't, in an aggregate sense, by using a series of different products, each with its own individual limit, expose themselves over the course of a workday to multiple hazards. And lastly, is personal protective equipment. The workers wear something, and in this case, again, from an inhalation perspective, it's a respirator. You may want to look at all the chemicals you use that require a respirator and say, what is our common respirator and cartridge? And can we find a cartridge that can be used for all our products, particularly for all products in one area, so workers aren't changing those cartridges every time they change the chemicals they use. So identifying common controls becomes easier if you can see all the hazards in your workplace in one spot. So this part was really giving you some ideas, giving you some information. I've thrown some graphs at you, I've thrown some numbers at you. But at the end of the day, can this make your workplace safer? So we're going to go through a case study of one organization we worked with and show you, the before and after, and how this methodology helped them move from WHMIS through chemical safety. But before we do that, we're going to go to our last poll.
Okay, here's a good application question for you. How much would a 100-word summary of the hazards and control methods reduce the volume of information you're giving to your workers? So taking that WHMIS sheet and making it into a 100-word summary, how much would that reduce the volume of information that you are giving them? So wait for your responses to come in on that. It's a bit of a thought-provoking one. So take a minute to think about it and choose what you think the reduction in information would be. About 2/3 voting. And a few more responses still coming in here. Last chance, folks, before I close out the poll, and I'll share the results now. So Rob, 50% said 23%, or sorry, 50%, 23% of your respondents here said that it would reduce the volume of information by 50%. 46% of them said it would reduce the volume by 70%. 8% it would reduce by 90%, and 23 said it would reduce by a full 99% the volume of information. So spread out there, but most people are leaning on the 70% reduction, with fewer in the 90% range, and a surprising number up at 99, 23% up at 99.
All right, well, thank you for your feedback in the poll. As part of this case study, I'll show you what this organization achieved. So this organization has been in business for 50 years, and it employs 135 people in a single location, in a single building. We started working with them in 2017. At that time, they had 175 data sheets in 3 4-inch binders. So think of those big black 4-inch binders. There's three of those centrally located in this facility, which the employees could access. 90% of the sheets were out of date. And the reason this company contacted us and we worked with them was they knew they had to make the move from the MSDS, the old system, to the safety data sheets. The SDS is the new system. And they knew that was going to be a lot of work. And it was really hard for them to get excited about doing that work when they were just going to go into a binder that nobody read. They had no understanding of any exposure requirements or any exposure limits in Ontario, which products actually had ingredients where you would have to manage exposure. And they had no company-specific control measures, no workplace instructions for employees or workers on how to use the product safely. And no one was reading the safety data sheets. So like many binders of safety data sheets, it sat unloved, unread, covered in dust, ready for anybody who, should they change their mind, decide to read it. But really what was happening was this company was overwhelmed by the information they had. They were overwhelmed by the work it would require to update them. And then they were left with, once I've updated, what on earth do I do with all that information that is contained within those safety data sheets. And this is pretty typical of what we've seen in organizations, overwhelmed by that information. So let's just have a look at their collection now using some of the data analytics that we have available. So they've reduced to 118 products. And they've broken their work facility into 20 work areas. So the average worker now only needs to access 17 different sheets. So instead of this combined mass of everything in one location, now workers have a much smaller range of products that they use, interact with, and need the information for. That's a big change in the amount of information they have. 37 of the 118 products are not classified as hazardous according to WHMIS 2015. And it doesn't mean that they should not worry about having the sheets. Having those sheets available confirms this for them and does contain information they may want to use. But over 30% of their products were not hazardous according to WHMIS 2015. Instead of the 79 different hazards which are contained within GHS, they had 42 unique hazards. So only 42 different hazard statements showed up in those 118 sheets. Now, of those 42, 17 had the signal word danger. So 17 hazard statements with the signal word danger across 118 products. And the dirty dozen, those 12 that we talked about earlier, they accounted for 92% of the occurrences of the danger hazard statements across 118 products. Gives you an idea that just focusing on those top hazards allows you to really deliver substantial improvement in safety performance. There were 47 ingredients with occupational exposure limits contained within these 118 up-to-date sheets. Now that may seem like a lot. What I would tell you is 4 of those ingredients accounted for 40% of the exposures. So it's typically, we see this in many organizations, it's typically the same types of ingredients show up. In this case, it was 2-propanol, ethanol, hydrogen peroxide, and sodium hydroxide. So they could see what are the ingredients that are most commonly found in the chemicals we use. Once they got down to the 118 sheets, only 3 products contained designated substances. Now in Ontario, in addition to exposure limits, there's a number of chemicals which are on the designated substance list, which has very stringent use requirements. They were down to 3 products on that list, and none of them require any type of exposure monitoring program. And one of the things they did do was work to eliminate products that were on the designated substance list. And the last piece that they discovered, and this was not a health and safety related piece, but they found that the same different departments were buying the same product. In fact, for one product they used, they found they had 7 different suppliers. So there's an opportunity to improve, not so much from a health and safety perspective, but just from an efficiency and business waste perspective. So let's talk about the results. What did it look like after they had gone through and done this work? Well, from a chemical perspective, they found they had 48 duplicate or obsolete products. So 27% of the information they had, they didn't even require. Now, unlike an example I talked about earlier, in this case, they had lots of sheets for products they no longer had in-house. But again, this idea, you still need to understand what products you're using. They eliminated 9 products. They eliminated or substituted 9 products because they were too hazardous. One of the products was a soap. When we first saw the sheet for the soap and the statement suspected of causing cancer, we thought, wow, that's got to be a pretty special soap that you're willing to use a soap that's suspected of causing cancer from a hygiene perspective. It turns out there's nothing special about the soap. The people who used it, who were both had university degrees in science and both had WHMIS education, had not read the information and had no idea of the hazard. Once they saw it, they just stopped using it right away. So part of the reason of getting rid of that number of products, number of sheets, is just eliminating those products where the hazard is not worth the benefit of the product. Now let's talk about what it meant to the workers, because these are the people we're really trying to protect, is the people who handle those chemicals every day. All their products have clear, concise instructions available. That addresses regulatory requirements. It provides specific direction. There's no wear appropriate gloves. It says wear neoprene gloves. And it eliminates the bystander effect because the information is provided to you. It's not a decision that you need to make. In the process, it reduced the amount of information they received by 99.7%, by eliminating products they weren't using, by breaking down to the 20 work areas in the 17 products as opposed to the 175, and then going to the 100-word summary, substantially reduced the information that workers were provided. Once the system was up and running, they redid their WHMIS training. It took half the time of the previous sessions they had conducted. The reason? They knew what hazards they had in the workplace, and they trained and focused on those hazards and didn't worry about providing all the information that's contained within WHMIS that was not required for employees in workers in that workplace. Now, we talked earlier about empowerment and how do you measure empowerment and are people empowered? Well, one way people is empowered is if you give them information that they access and use. So after this system went live at this location, 45 employees per month accessed the information. They went into the system, they pulled up information on specific products or chemicals and looked at it. 18 months later, there's still 7 to 10 times a month, someone is going in and looking at that information. Comparing that to the unread binders. So I think if you want people to be empowered, you need to give them information that they can access, they can understand, and act on. And lastly, what does this mean to the employer? I said at the beginning when I was talking about the ACT process that managers have to own auditing. That means they need to be interested in what's going on. I've had 22 different bosses in my career, some good, and some frankly not very good. But the best piece of advice I ever received was from the person who I would have called my best boss. He told me, what interests my boss fascinates me. When I heard that initially, I thought, well, that's his way of telling me I better do what he asks. What he really meant was, if you want people to do something, you have to show an interest in what they're doing. If all you ask people to do is, have you completed your WHMIS education or are your safety data sheets up to date? That's likely what they'll do. If you want more from people, if you want them to do more, you need to ask more. And the challenge as a safety professional is how to get your boss interested in chemical safety. Well, the information we were able to provide to the director of this organization got him interested. He's personally followed up with employees based on what he's learned about chemical safety. And this is what he told us. This is excellent information for us to have. So this is one example of one organization, but I hope it illustrates the improvement that you can make in chemical safety if you can make use of your WHMIS information. But to make use of that WHMIS information when you have limited resources means two things. Focus on the hazards and use data analytics to gain that insight into the information within those sheets so you can set health and safety priorities. So let's take a minute and go back through the 6 steps that I identified as part of that process of improving chemical safety. The first 3 are ones that really address employer approach and responsibilities. How should you approach chemical safety? So the first one was really focus on the 3 key employer responsibilities. Know the products you use. Then it's understand the hazards. And then lastly, it's train workers using clear, simple language on how to manage the risk. Those 3 things are at the heart of chemical safety from an employer perspective. Why empowerment doesn't work. So if someone says, oh, we just give people the sheets and they'll read them, remember, it doesn't work, and here's why. There's too many regulations that workers are not going to understand. The safety data sheets don't give you specific information. They tell you to wear appropriate gloves. The time commitment involved to reading those sheets is extensive. And most of us, in a situation of this complexity, are bystanders. We're looking for someone else to act. And lastly, from an approach perspective, think about triaging your hazards. Not all hazards are created equal. Use the signal words, the symbols, and the hazard statements to triage your hazards to identify those areas of greatest risk. Once you've got that approach locked down, then it's using data. And if you don't have your own data, start with the ones that we've just described. These are the most common hazard statements that we see across over 40 organizations. Once you establish what your hazards are, you can eliminate and substitute, or you can identify those common controls. So taking these last three actions and just kind of diving down just a little bit deeper, how do you get started? Here's the list of the 12 products. Now you might feel you have a pretty good eye protection program, and that employees do a good job of storing flammables appropriately. You may say, I'm not concerned about people drinking products in our workplace. So that then takes you down to causes severe skin burns. And that may be where you say, I think I'm going to start and look at this one. Well, talk to your glove supplier. Ask them to review your glove program, and do you have the right gloves available? This may seem simplistic, but we have run into organizations that don't even have the right type of glove available. And glove suppliers are more than happy to do this type of work for you. But it's also an opportunity to look at all the chemicals you handle and say, can I find one glove type that meets all my needs? So I'm not asking workers to change gloves or remember to use the right type of glove. You might also be concerned about products that may cause cancer. Use your Joint Health and Safety Committee to review that list of products and see if you can find alternatives. You know, this may cause cancer really is, can I eliminate these products and either stop using them altogether or find an alternative that's safer? Back to the example we talked about earlier of graffiti remover. This isn't going to solve all your concerns right away, but chemical safety, like all safety processes, is a journey. You need to start, and you want to start with your highest risks, knowing I'll probably never have the resources to do everything, but if I'm managing my highest risks, I'm going to make a step change in chemical safety. I will leave you with this thought. I ran a chemical plant that worked 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We set out to improve performance in all areas by creating clear, concise operating procedures. If I was asked, well, what makes an acceptable set of instructions? I would say it's got to pass the 2 a.m. Saturday morning test. And that test is pretty simple. Are the instructions compatible with or consistent with our operational standards? And can and will people follow those instructions when they're tired, when they want to be somewhere else, when there's no one else to ask a question of? So if you want to achieve great chemical safety, ask yourself if your current WHMIS program passes the 2 a.m. Saturday morning test. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I'm going to turn things back over to Erin, and she's going to coordinate the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Rob. So folks, we do have quite a bit of time here for Q&A. We're glad to take your questions. So if you haven't had a chance to type that into the message window yet, or you've been thinking about a question, please go ahead and do that now while I ask the first couple of questions. Actually, the first one is a comment, Rob. James says that regarding SDS content, it's important to remind workers that SDS is not a risk assessment. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely true. You know, what the suppliers do in the safety data sheet is they provide you information on the hazards. And that's a start of a risk assessment, but it is not a risk assessment. The next piece is at the employer level, understanding those hazards, and then what does that mean from a risk assessment? And it's really severity of the hazard and the likelihood of that hazard impacting people. That creates the risk assessment.
Great. And a question for you as well, Rob, regarding the 100-word summaries. When we think about our workers having different learning styles, different reading levels, are there strategies and recommendations you have around addressing those? And I'm just going to take us to
so
while you answer.
One of the things I feel very strongly about is ensuring that the 100 words are really 100 words that are actually actionable. So don't say, wear nitrile gloves. If your nitrile gloves that you use in your facility are black and are found on shelf 17, say that, wear black nitrile gloves found on shelf 17. Be as specific as possible. And when you're specific, it actually takes fewer words, in my experience, to explain what to do than when you're providing general instructions.
Great, thank you. So a question from Sind Souls. How do you summarize the SDS? Do you use a template or is this a workplace label?
So we've summarized the SDSs in many different ways. We've read through them and used Excel data sheets. We've used automated tools that will read and process the information for you. And that's probably the fastest way to do it is through the use of automated tools.
Great. So we do have a little more time for questions, folks, if you have anything else. Last chance to get your question answered directly by Rob. Any final thoughts, Rob, for them on how to take back to their workplace? Ideas you've given them pretty good ideas of where to start in terms of selecting where they're at on the 12 most common. But any last thoughts from you on next steps for the folks in the webinar?
When you've got an overwhelming volume of information, sometimes it's hard to know where to start, and there's a feeling that maybe I'll start on the wrong spot. What I would say is the most important thing to start. It's the Chinese proverb: the longest journey begins with a single step. If you're starting with a specific type of hazard or a specific department to develop those clear, simple instructions for employees, you're starting to make improvements. You're not going to do it overnight. It's going to take time, but at least you're getting that process going.
Great, thank you. And we had a question asking about the PowerPoint, another one asking about the recording. So folks, so you know, the handout you can download right from here, but also tomorrow you'll get an email from GoToWebinar directly that will have a link for you to a web page where we'll have the recording and the handout for you to look at or download. We do not give out the PowerPoint, but the recording is there if you want to go back and look at any particular slide, and the handout has all of the key points in it there for you as well. So James said, a very interesting and useful webinar. Thank you. So I'm not seeing any other questions come in, Rob, so I'll just thank you now for your time today, for sharing your many years of expertise and this unique approach to safety management. And folks, everybody in the webinar, thank you for joining us today. We hope you've learned something and could take the material you've learned today back to your workplaces to make them safer. Good Christmas gift to your workplace for the holidays. When you leave the webinar today, you'll see a survey pop up on your screen. We'd really love to have your feedback on the webinar so that we can continue to improve this professional development program that we offer for CSSE members. So thanks everyone, have a great day, and keep an eye out for the upcoming webinars. We're about to release in early January, we'll release our reschedule for next year, and you'll see some interesting topics coming up in the first few months of 2020 as well. So thanks everyone, have a safe day.
Thank you.